Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 3 of our Clean Water Activist Training Series. Today, we'll be diving into water and equity. We'll be leaving some time after the presentation to answer any questions you may have, but please feel free to use the chat function to enter them as we move along the presentation. We'll get to them at the end. And with that, let's get started. All right. Next slide. In order to truly achieve clean water for all, it is our responsibility to stand up for those most affected by climate change. We must look beyond the problem and directly address the shortcomings of the climate movement. To better understand the magnitude of the environmental injustice, let's look at how environmental racism has disproportionately affected low-income communities and communities of color throughout the nation. Next slide. But first, what is environmental racism? It is the disproportionate burden of environmental hazards placed on people of color. This oppression is often achieved systemically through policies and practices that effectively place low-income and communities of color close to polluting facilities like oil refineries, factories, landfills, or infrastructure like major highways. A study conducted by the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as EPA, found that race is often a more reliable indicator of proximity to pollution than income alone. And as climate change worsens, increasing events like extreme drought, major floods, wildfires, and urban heat islands, for many low-income communities and communities of color, these impacts are compounded by decades of disproportionate exposure to pollution. Next slide. For generations, systemic racism has put communities of color on the front line of the climate crisis. Consider this. A study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, USA, shows that even though Black and Hispanic people in the US are exposed to more air pollution than white people, these groups consume less from the industries generating much of that pollution. That means Latinos breathe 63% more than they produce, and Black Americans breathe 56%, while whites breathe 17% less. A 2016 study by the Center of Effective Government found that children of color make up almost 2/3 of the 5.7 million children who live within 1 mile of a high-risk chemical facility in the United States. And nearly 1 in 10 US school children attend one of the 12,000 schools that are located within 1 mile of a dangerous chemical facility. Living close to pollution, often the same emissions driving the climate crisis, exposes people of color to a variety of harmful pollutants at a higher rate than white and higher wealth communities. This leads to far greater rates of serious health problems in communities of color, from cancer to lung conditions to heart attacks, as well as a higher prevalence and severity of asthma, lower birth weights, and a greater incidence of high blood pressure. Next slide. Access to clean, safe, and affordable water is a right, not a privilege. Yet, many remain without water access, whether it's access to running water, indoor plumbing, or safe drinking water. Concerns about water access and water safety among minority groups have been reported at increasing rates since the 1950s. For example, a report by Dig Deep and Water Alliance found that Native American households are 19 times more likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. And the people of the Navajo Nation have dealt with water contamination due to uranium mining since the 1950s, contamination made worse by the Gold King mine wastewater spill in 2015. Or the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, a city where more than half of the population is people of color, and a city that has been dealing with community-led poisoning since 2014. Adding to the horror, a report from the EPA found more than 30 million Americans lived in areas where water systems violated safety rules at the beginning of just last year, which tells us we are far from achieving water equity across the nation. Next slide. So everyone deserves to live in a clean, healthy environment because clearly the environment around us affects our health. Now that we have a better understanding of what environmental racism is and its impacts across the nation, Let's look at how climate inequality impacts our state and our region. Next slide. The Calimbiro screen is a geospatial tool that analyzes data on California's environmental, public health, and socioeconomic conditions to help provide a clear picture of the connection between pollution burdens and vulnerabilities in communities throughout the state. Utilizing this data, the Calimbiro screen developed a race and ethnicity analysis to show disparities with respect to racial makeup of communities with the highest pollution burdens and vulnerabilities. The figure you see here shows the percentage of people of color and white populations living in the least and most impacted communities in the state. The circle chart on the left shows us that 33% people of color and 67% white live in the 10% least impacted neighborhoods, while the chart on the right shows us that 91% people of color and 9% white live in the 10% most impacted neighborhoods in California. These figures demonstrate significant differences in the racial makeup between the least and most impacted neighborhoods. Next slide. Now let's dig a little deeper. So this figure here is examining the circle charts that we just saw at a more in-depth view. So as you can see, the topmost horizontal bar shows the race and ethnic makeup of the least impacted communities. So you can see, the 67% white, but then the 33% is broken down by racial and ethnic groups. As we travel down the chart, we begin to see the race and ethnic makeup of the most impacted communities. We should note that due to their small number relative to other racial and ethnic groups, Native Americans and Pacific Islanders were grouped into the other category in this figure. So what we're seeing is that Latinos and Black Americans in California disproportionately reside in highly impacted communities, while other groups tend to reside disproportionately in less impacted communities. Previous versions of Calimbiro screen data and this race and ethnicity analysis report have found similar findings. So from that, we are realizing that this trend is consistent and prevalent throughout the state and over the years. Next slide. And unfortunately, we are seeing the same trend in LA. This map here shows that the highest level of pollution aggregation coincides with communities already burdened by poverty and the lack of sufficient infrastructure to support health, such as parks. It demonstrates the disparity across the county, where the communities burdened by a disproportionate share of environmental pollution also face socioeconomic and health challenges. Next slide. But what contributes to this disparity between communities? One factor is historic racist housing policies. In Los Angeles, redlining has left low-income individuals and people of color to be disproportionately exposed to the impacts of environmental burdens. According to the University of Michigan, neighborhoods marked as high risk for investment over 8 decades ago are 74% low to moderate income and 64% minority today. The historical lack of resources, investment, and development has resulted in poor infrastructure that increases vulnerability to environmental hazards, such as having oil fields or landfills built in certain communities or increasing urban heat island effect. Next slide. So what is heat island effect? It is when in a metropolitan area, it is significantly warmer than its surroundings. These heat islands form as vegetation is replaced by asphalt, roads, buildings, and other structures necessary to accommodate a growing city. By displacing trees and vegetation, we minimize the natural cooling effect and shading and evaporation. And instead, we are trapping hot air thanks to the buildings and asphalt, and that increases the outside temperature by as much as 10 degrees. The graphic here shows the correlation between surface temperature and household income. What we're seeing is that areas that are hotter in this map in dark red tend to be in lower income neighborhoods on the map on the right in light green. Lower income parts of the city tend to have less green cover and are located near undesirable land uses, such as highways or industrial areas. And as average temperatures continue to rise, lower income communities are more likely to experience more heat than wealthy, which then leads to an increase in heat-related conditions such as asthma, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and even heart disease. Now let's talk water. Next slide. Over the years, Los Angeles has experienced its fair share of drought, and this has pushed the region to depend on outside resources to meet our local water needs. And thanks to the acceleration of the climate crisis and our poor water management, we have found ourselves reeling in the impact of a more dangerous type of drought, a mega drought. Our reservoirs and snowpacks are at record lows. These sources that we once relied on are literally drying up before our eyes. As you can see on this map here, the entire state of California and the Western United States is in some state of drought. And drought creates devastating results for our environment and the life that depends on it. Next slide. Currently, the Los Angeles region relies on imported water for nearly 2/3 of our water supply. This water travels hundreds of miles across farmland, deserts, and mountains via the State Water Project or aqueducts. This process is not only energy intensive and costly, but wasteful. When water moves from the Colorado River or the Sierras through an aqueduct to Southern California, water can leak out of the aqueduct into the ground or simply evaporate. A significant amount of water can be lost in these water delivery systems. And by depending on these largely fragmented, energy and resource intensive, antiquated systems, we are not only running through our scarce water supply, but continuing to disconnect from local communities. Next slide. And that leads us to water affordability issues. Our dependency on water imports have left the urban water management system in LA County archaic and complex. As we mentioned in our previous training, Los Angeles County's 10 million residents get their drinking water from 200 plus agencies. They range from the giant Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, a public utility, to the tiny privately run systems that provide waters to residents in more remote areas. With drought as our new normal, a lot of these agencies have launched a host of programs to encourage conservation, such as rebates for consumers to help replace lawns with drought-resistant plants, but most have resorted to raising rates. According to research done by UCLA, some Los Angeles County households pay 10 times as much as others for the same amount of water. It all just depends on which water agency serves their neighborhood. And for many low-income community members, they can't tap into rebates for conservation projects because they can't afford the upfront cost to, say, lawn replacement, or they have no access to the kind of subsidies that help pay skyrocketing bills. And things are only getting worse as aging water systems need costly improvements and drought conditions prolong. An estimated 500,000 Californians lost drinking water access in 2019, and it's only going to increase because water shutoffs due to failure to pay their water bills might happen more often than not. By over-relying on imported water and underinvesting in local water supplies, we are depriving the region of the opportunity for equitable, sustainable, and climate-resilient water supplies and affordability. Next slide. But water supply is not the only problem that Californians and Angelenos in underprivileged areas will bear the brunt of. In a drought year, these communities will be more likely to see inequitable impacts in water quality. Low-income communities of color are often disproportionately affected by contaminated soil and aquifers, as well as inadequate or unmaintained infrastructure. It is not surprising that distrust of tap water is pervasive among low-income families. According to the 2015 American Housing Survey, 30% of Hispanic households and 25% of Black households in the Los Angeles and Long Beach metro area reported that their water is not safe to drink, compared to only 12% of non-Hispanic white households. Inequities also extend to the stormwater arena. Low-income communities also experience greater flooding risks from inadequate or outdated storm drain infrastructure. And the lack of parks or open spaces that usually act as natural filtration systems are often not found in these communities. That leads to flooding that carries untreated urban runoff across communities and affects the region's waterways and those waterways most closely to these communities. It degrades water quality, which creates negative health impacts such as illness from exposure to tainted water, forcing beach and river closures, which decreases the amount of recreational opportunities, and it degrades groundwater resources. Next slide. So we just went through and learned of the multitude of environmental injustices plaguing our nation, our state, and our region. It might seem daunting, and the question lies, how do we address these issues head on? How can we ensure sustainable and equitable water policies, and how can we ensure clean and safe, healthy waters for all Angelenos? Next slide. There is no one right answer. The fight for environmental justice is a long and winding road, but it begins by understanding that the water movement is also an equity movement. We must amplify the voices of those impacted by water decisions and reverse inequities in our local and statewide policies. Next slide. The climate crisis impacts us all, but we just spent this entire presentation proving that there are, in fact, disproportionate effects of the crisis on certain communities. And everyone is entitled to clean, safe water. But this journey begins by investing in the communities that have been disproportionately affected by centuries of systemic racism. That is why justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work is critical. Not only must we seek to create an equitable water future by providing all people with access to clean, safe water at a price they can afford, but also increase equitable representation at the highest levels of decision-making so that we have diverse voices ensuring resources and decisions are representative of all communities. Next slide. Here at LA Waterkeeper, our mission is to fight for the health of the region's waterways and for sustainable, equitable, and climate-friendly water supplies. But we have an added responsibility to advocate for the environmental protection of the systemically repressed communities whose voices are ignored. We cannot achieve clean water for all without addressing environmental racism and the current and historic ways frontline communities have been and are disproportionately affected by pollution, our aging infrastructure, and the economic burden of ineffective and wasteful investments and policies. As protectors of a public resource, we commit to actively pursuing and creating systemic change in our water movement and the greater environmental movement as well. We hope that this information encourages you to continue to advocate for your community locally, statewide, and even nationally. This information isn't meant to scare you, it's meant to motivate you to get your voice out and make sure that you stand up for the things that matter to you. And in part 4, we will be sharing current issues and campaigns LA Waterkeeper is working on right now and show you that there are various ways that you can get involved and make sure that all our communities have access to safe, clean water. Now, if you have any questions, please ask away. We are here to answer the best we can. Thank you.